It's great to be here with all of you. So I'm supposed to talk about the Constitution, the Supreme Court, and why it matters to you. And those of you who remember your American history class know that our founders actually thought the Supreme Court wasn't really going to matter very much. Alexander Hamilton, who you know the songs about, Hamilton said in Federalist Paper 78 that the Supreme Court was going to be the judiciary is going to be the least dangerous branch because it had neither force nor will. It was just a building with a bunch of judges, but it couldn't ever command a case to be brought to it, and Hamilton said wouldn't be able to do very much in our American democracy. Well, I'm here to talk to you for a few minutes about why that's just totally bonk and why actually the Supreme Court matters hugely. And why it matters is because it interprets that document, the Constitution of the United States. That Constitution's only a few thousand words long, that's it. But it sets the blueprint for what our democracy is all about. And the judges, the justices on the court, as well as judges around the country, have to interpret that document. And these things matter hugely to you, hugely. Because when the Supreme Court says something is unconstitutional, it means it can't happen. So take, for example, the strongest case is Roe versus Wade, 1973. Texas had passed a law saying you can't have abortions, that it was against the law, and putting people in jail, women in jail, doctors in jail for performing abortions. And so they challenged that. They said women said it was a violation of their right to privacy. And they brought it up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court agreed. They struck the Texas law down as unconstitutional and made a ruling for all 50 states. So even if 100% of people now in a state want to restrict abortion or ban abortion, you can't do it because the Supreme Court has said, that's a fundamental right. Our democracy can't touch it. It's beyond democracy. So that's abortion. Another example, which I think some of you are living proof of, is Brown versus Board of Education. And in 1954, the legendary litigator, later to become a justice on the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall, brings a case because all across the South, we had schools for African Americans and schools for everyone else. And that was voted on by the democratically elected legislatures in these states. And the people wanted that, the majority of the people wanted it. There were, of course, all sorts of restrictions on who could vote at the time, so it wasn't like the legislatures were that representative. But in any event, Thurgood brought the case up to the Supreme Court and said, separate can't be equal, that it violates our equality guarantees in our Constitution and the 14th Amendment. And the Supreme Court unanimously agrees, striking down those segregated schools all across the land, even if everyone in a southern state wanted to have those schools. You can't do it. But as I told you, the founders thought that the court was going to be the least powerful branch, and school desegregation is a good example. Because what happened afterwards was that some southern governors resisted and said, nope, we're going to keep our schools segregated. And they said, look, justices, you're in Washington, D.C. I'm in Little Rock, Arkansas. I can do whatever I want. I'm the governor. And what did our president do then? Our president ordered federal marshals to come in and escort African Americans into the previously white school. Supreme Court couldn't do it. Supreme Court had no army. It depended on a president who cared about the rule of law. That's something I'm going to get back to in a minute. But the court could only deal with the case that came in front of it, which is desegregation in schools. There was also all sorts of other stuff. My dad landed in 1960 from India in Newport News, Virginia. And he landed after he was on a long boat ride. And it took several weeks. And he lands there, and the first thing he sees, he wants to go to the restroom. And he sees a restroom for coloreds and a restroom for whites. And he was Indian. He didn't know which one to go in. But that's what the rules were then. Even though in schools, the Supreme Court had said everything would change, it hadn't gotten to everything else, public accommodations and the like. Think about affirmative action. A lot of schools now, universities, have tried to have affirmative action programs to prefer certain minorities. And they've been challenged by Caucasian students who say, this violates my rights of equality. I should get the same ability to get in as someone else. And this went all the way up to the Supreme Court last year in the University of Texas case. And the Supreme Court, by a very close decision, said that's not unconstitutional. Schools, you want to have affirmative action, that's okay. You're allowed to do that. Smartphones, you all have smartphones. You know, basically the rules for most of our lifetimes has been if you're arrested by a cop, they can search anything on you, so incident to arrest. So if you have a crumpled cigarette container, which was a Supreme Court case, you know, or something like that, they can look in and to see if you have any contraband or anything like that. That's permitted. Well, cops started using this with phones. First flip phones, if you know what those are, I'm not sure. But they existed a while ago, and they had only phone numbers, basically. And now with smartphones. And they just you know, they could stop you for a, you know, driving violation, and they would look through all of your smartphones, everything on there. So this was challenged last year in the Supreme Court. It says a violation of privacy. And the Supreme Court, and I know a lot of folks think the Supreme Court's conservative, Republican, law and order. Supreme Court unanimously said those searches can't happen. That our smartphones contain so much information, romantic information, health information, financial, Lord knows what's on your smartphones, that you don't have the ability to come in and search that if you're a police officer without going to a judge and getting permission to do so. So big decisions that matter to you. You know, I know some of your schools are plagued with violence. Congress passed a law 20 years ago to prohibit guns from being brought into public schools or within 1,000 feet of those schools. Sounds like a good idea. Supreme Court, 5-4, says you can't do that. You can't restrict people's guns near schools. That Congress lacks the power to do that. Again, declaring it unconstitutional. This law was overwhelmingly something that Congress wanted to do, but nope, the Supreme Court took it off the table, said you can't do it. Another challenge like that, which some of you are familiar with, is President Obama's Affordable Care Act, the so-called Obamacare plan. President Obama said there are 50 million Americans who are uninsured, and I want to reform the insurance markets so that they will have insurance. And that was challenged by 26 states, saying that's unconstitutional, Obama. You can't do that. Supreme Court, very close decision, 5-4, says Obama's right. Chief Justice Roberts, appointed by President George W. Bush, cast a deciding vote in favor of President Obama in June of 2012, right before the election. And I think it's fair to say if that vote had gone the other way, President Obama wouldn't have had a second term. You had a Republican-nominated Chief Justice siding with a Democratic president in that case and effectively handing him a second term. That's what the Constitution is at its best. It's not just something that for Republicans on one side or Democrats on the other. There are principles in it that really matter. And so let me just close with telling you about one set of challenges now going to the Supreme Court, which I'll argue in October, which is President Trump's so-called Muslim ban. So President Trump campaigned on the idea, he called for a, quote, total and complete shutdown of Muslim immigration to the United States. He said, quote, I think Islam hates us. Hates us. And so he signs an executive order which is labeled something like protecting the United States against threats or something like that. He looks up at the camera and he says, we all know what that means. And we do know what that means. President Trump enacted a ban which has two things, both aimed at Muslims. One is it restricts immigration from 6 countries, and those 6 countries have Muslim populations between 90.9% and 99.95%. And second, it bans refugees anywhere in the world from coming to our shores for 120 days, no matter how grave the humanitarian crisis they feel is. And I don't know if you've seen pictures from Syria and what's going on there, but I encourage you to look because they're hard to look at. But the idea that we would, turn a blind eye to what's going on there because of a silly campaign promise is I think, very unfortunate. So we've challenged this as a violation of the Constitution. Our First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. What does that mean? Well, you go back to the founders, and they understood that governments would establish disfavored religions. They thought certain religions were really beyond the pale. Catholics was a good example. And so like the colonial Virginia banned Catholics from immigrating because they wanted to have a pure religious state for themselves. And James Madison said, among other founders, said that is not America. America should be a place, a beacon of freedom, welcoming people of all faiths. We don't care who you pray to. And so he wrote his famous Remonstrance in 1785, which is about this idea that America should stand, and its states should stand for something bigger and have a spirit of tolerance. And he was worried that immigration laws would be used to target disfavored religions. And so that's why the First Amendment reads the way it does. And that's what we are challenging. We've won it in virtually every court. And now it's going to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court on Monday, 2 days ago, agreed to hear our case. And so we'll argue it in October. And we'll argue that it is we'll argue it's an establishment of religion. And if you look on your dollar bills or your coins, they have this phrase, e pluribus unum. Anyone know what it means, e pluribus unum? Nope, in God we trust is not a yes in the back. Out of many one, exactly, out of many one. And if you look around this room, I think that you see exactly that American, that founder spirit. It is our national motto and enshrined in the law. And that's the principle that we're fighting for, the idea that America welcomes people of all faiths. We're stronger because we do. We don't isolate them and relegate them and make fun of them or say that all of them, all the billions of them, hate us or want to do us harm. That's not American at all. And so that's the essence of the challenge. And I think, it's going to be brought before a Supreme Court that has 5 Republican-appointed justices, 4 Democrats. And so some people are saying, oh, there's no way anyone can win against President Trump. But I don't think that's the right way to think about the Constitution, and I don't think it's the right way to think about the Supreme Court. I mean, every time I go up to the Supreme Court and argue, it's remarkable. There are 9 of them. They come from very different perspectives. But they are working their tails off to try and get it right. And they're asking really hard questions. And you got to give them lightning fast answers that are well researched and the like. And they're doing the best they can. And I don't think they're approaching this from the lens of politics. And I think the best example of that is what I was saying before about the Chief Justice and President Obama. So we'll bring the case, and hopefully we will win. But you will find out in a few months. I've got a little time for questions, so I'm going to start with you over there. Yes, yes. Right, no, you right there. Yes. Oh, yes, if we're doing mics, then go for it.
Hi, my name is Amal, and I have a question. You said President, I'm not sure, I forgot which one it was, but he was the one who enforced the board versus, Brown versus
yeah.
So what happens? Like, who's going to enforce the Supreme Court, cases if the president is not going to do that? Like, what is our responsibility?
That is a beautiful question because, back after Brown versus Board of Education, we could trust a president to say, hey, maybe this wasn't the decision I would make, but I'm not on the Supreme Court, and my job is to enforce the law. The president in Article 2 of the Constitution swears an oath to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And I think you do have to worry a little bit about this president. Every time he's lost one of these cases, he goes, what's his reaction? He goes and attacks the judge. He calls them so-called judges and makes fun of them. He even made fun of a judge for having Mexican parents, even though that judge was born in America, and said, oh, you can't be fair to me. That is not the American spirit. And if he refuses to abide by a Supreme Court decision, I suspect there will be hell to pay. And there will be, a complete breakdown of our political order. And I sure hope that that doesn't happen. But so far, he hasn't given me much to suggest that we should be confident that he will continue the traditions of every other president, which has been to respect the wishes of the Supreme Court. He's obviously free to disagree and say, hey, I don't like that decision, but to not enforce it is another step. Okay. So the further question is, should we impeach him? What should we do as citizens? I think it'll depend on that circumstance and what happens there. But a president that refuses to enforce a Supreme Court decision, impeachment is I think, definitely on the table in such a scenario. Okay, and right there. Right here.
So yesterday, Sally Yates kind of spoke to the fact that she was unaware of the travel ban even going into effect. What does that do to the public sanctity of things like the Department of Justice and the Supreme Court and even Congress if our president isn't willing to respect those institutions? Then how is the public supposed to?
Right, so great question, and if you haven't seen Sally Yates talk yesterday at the Aspen Institute, she was dragged down by me with her, but watch her part, skip mine. But it's really quite phenomenal. She was the acting attorney general right at the start of the new administration. She's been a long time Justice Department employee, very much considered kind of by the book, great prosecutor. And she revealed that President Trump had completely cut her out of all of these policies. And boy, that to me is one of the worst things you can do in a senior government position. I mean, I had a senior government position. The most important thing you can do is get information from a wide variety of sources. Everyone's trying to tell you what they think you want to hear. But that's not good. You want the truth. And the only way to get the truth is by going and ferreting it out from everywhere, not cutting people out and saying, oh, only my trusted, hand-picked cabal of a few people are going to get to make policy. Because that does destroy institutions. It's demoralizing for the people who work there, and they feel like they're not doing anything or they're actually helping enable an evil policy. And it just leads to, really short-sighted and bad policies, of which this Muslim ban is one. Basically, the president has said, I really need this for national security, and the courts have said, well, what's your evidence? Why do you really need it for national security? And so he comes back with a whole new executive order saying, here's why I need it for national security. It has two pieces of evidence in it. One is 2 people from Iraq have come to the United States and committed acts of terrorism. But he forgot that his new executive order exempts Iraq. It's not in the countries. It's not in the 6 countries. It was in his earlier one, but he took it out. So that didn't help him. And then the other thing he says is, well, there was a refugee from Somalia who came to the United States at the age of 2 and grew up and committed acts of terror. But he forgot that his executive order exempts children. Children are allowed to come in. So that's just a byproduct of having a ham-handed policy, apparatus and just, putting people in a room who you trust to make policy and no one else.
What about the public opinion? The public kind of disregard, because I know I've heard, Donald J. Trump is doing it, so... And they kind of just, that conversation goes like that. So what do you do at that point? Like, how do you tell people that this has been our government for 200 years and it deserves respect? Absolutely,
because I think you got to sing it from the rooftops. You got to do it in blogs and in every place that you possibly can to say this is not what America stands for. And I think I'm really worried about something that you're saying, which is that people model themselves on presidential behavior. And when presidents feel like they can denigrate people based on their religion or their disability, or attack authority every time they lose a case. I mean, my son is a debater. He's, some of you I think are. And, whenever he loses a debate, I think his first reaction, at least when he was young, was, that judge was terrible. And, we talk about it and say, that's not the right way to think about it. You lost the judge. For whatever reason, your job is to persuade the judge. You didn't. And, to have President Trump going and attacking not just like some debate judge who's like some parent or something, but judges who have been nominated by presidents and confirmed by the United States Senate for these important positions, and then every time he loses to attack them instead of thinking, well, maybe I did something wrong myself. I think it's a terribly, terribly corrosive thing. Okay, we'll have one last, we are out of time, so I'm sorry. But thank you. It's great to be here.